Thank you. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here today, but unfortunately I have to start with an apology, and I know it's going to be a huge disappointment to most of you, and that is that I have absolutely no PowerPoint slides to share with you today. And I can understand your disappointment if you want to go out and check email and do something productive. Completely understand. But what I'm hoping to do is share with you, I'm excited about the topic and the theme of the day. As was mentioned, I lead a research center called the Center for the Edge. And the charter of that center is basically identifying emerging business opportunities that should be on the CEO's agenda, but are not, and do the research to persuade them to put it on the agenda. And we've looked at a pretty broad range of opportunities. We've been around for about 7 years. And I will say that many, if not most of the opportunities have some platform component to them. So I'm quite excited about the focus of today's discussion. I'll also say that as we've looked into platforms of various types, we've come to believe that not all platforms are created equal. And there are some platforms that have the potential to create far more value than others. And so I want to share with you some of those perspectives and hopefully get some feedback in terms of helping to drive our research forward. So as context for this perspective, we've spent a lot of time trying to understand the long-term forces that are reshaping the global business landscape. It's something that we call the big shift, which defines a lot of our beliefs about how the world is changing. It basically focuses on two fundamental forces that are transforming the global business landscape. One is digital technology infrastructures that are exponentially improving, show no signs of slowing down on any dimension, and combined with long-term public policy shifts that over time on a global scale have been leading to more economic liberalization, more ability of products, ideas, people, material to move across boundaries, national, geographic boundaries, and industry boundaries. And when you combine those two together, those two fundamental forces, in economic terms, what it's doing is systematically reducing barriers to entry and barriers to movement on a global scale. That's great if you're an attacker. It's pretty dismal if you're an incumbent who has a leadership position today. And the result is, we believe, significant mounting performance pressure on all companies of all types. Even the attackers, who today are attackers, tomorrow will be defenders. So one quick evidence of this mounting performance pressure, we've looked at a measure of performance for all public companies in the United States over a period of decades. We basically went back to 1965, just before digital infrastructure started to get deployed, to today. And we looked as a measure of performance, return on assets. Not a perfect measure, but we think good enough to give an indication of how are companies doing with all this wonderful digital technology that's now available to us. The answer is that over that time period, since 1965, for all public companies in the US, return on assets has basically collapsed. It's declined by 75%. It's been a long-term, sustained erosion. There is no sign of it leveling off, certainly no sign of it turning around. So if you want a measure of mounting performance pressure, we think that's a good indicator that there's a lot of pressure and it ain't going away. So in that context, one of the key elements that we think is contributing to this pressure is that we've got an increasing disconnect between the way the world is evolving, the broader environment is evolving, and the way businesses are operated. And there are many ways to characterize that disconnect. One of the ways that we have spent time articulating is, we call it at a simple level, moving from push to pull. And the basic notion here is that if you think about all the great companies that were established in the 20th century and that we all know and love, they were basically driven by a push-based model. The model was essentially you develop a forecast or prediction of demand, And then you make sure that all the right people and the right resources are in exactly the right place at the right time to meet that demand. You push them to meet that demand. And it's hugely efficient if your predictions and forecasts are accurate. It's hugely inefficient if, God forbid, those predictions and forecasts don't work out because you're scrambling at the last minute trying desperately to rearrange things. We believe that as an alternative to the push-based model in this big shift, what we need are pull-based models, where basically the notion is how do you draw out people and resources when you need them and where you need them, on demand. That's a very different model. And we believe, again, one of the reasons for the mounting pressure here is that we've got a set of companies that are still driven by push-based models, and the response to mounting pressure is to squeeze harder and harder to get more efficiency, versus making the move to a pull-based model. And one of the key requirements for a pull-based model is scalable pull platforms, where you can draw out those people and resources at scale, not just talking about a few participants, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of participants, draw them out when you need them and where you need them. And I'll just make one other amplification on this pull notion, which is that we ended up focusing on 3 levels of pull that are becoming increasingly important. One level of pull is the notion of access. It's how do you, if you have a particular need for information or a person, how do you find that person very efficiently? Access them, pull them out. Google's a classic example of a pull-based platform. Hard to imagine. I have a hard time remembering what we did before Google, pre-Google. But that's just the simplest level of pull. It gets more interesting when you get to the second level of pull, which is what we call attract. How do you attract people and resources that you didn't even know existed? And in this rapidly changing world, there's so much out there that we don't even know to ask the question, much less find the person or the information. How do you attract them to you? It's that classic notion of serendipity, those unexpected encounters that when you have them, you say, my God, that was so helpful. There's an insight there that really helped me in a problem that I was dealing with, but I had no idea that that was available to me. So pull platforms can be very helpful in terms of attraction, amplifying attraction. And then there's a third level of pull, which we think ultimately is the most important and the most underestimated, which is how do you pull out of each of us as individuals and out of our institutions more of the potential that we have to achieve more of that potential. And it's ultimately about accelerating learning and performance improvement in a more rapidly changing world. So, 3 levels of pull that are becoming more and more helpful, and the need to think about what kinds of platforms can help in amplifying those 3 levels of pull. With that as context, I'm going to briefly kind of walk through 4 different types of platforms that we see emerging, and that all have incredible value, but as I'll try to argue, some have more value than others. So there's a first level of platform, which I would describe simply as an aggregation platform. It's aggregating lots of resources in one place that can be conveniently accessed. You can think about it as database platforms. You can think about it as marketplace platforms, an eBay or an Etsy. And very helpful in terms, you can think about it in terms of contests. You know, the crowdsourcing kinds of contests now, where you have a problem, you create a contest, and you aggregate solution providers and find somebody who actually comes up with the best answer. The common element across all of those aggregation platforms is they're very transaction-focused. They're focused on a transaction, finding a buyer, finding information, finding an answer to a problem, but it's basically a transaction-oriented platform. So that's one level of platform. There's a second level of platform which basically has to do with social platforms. It's, again, aggregating, but now we're aggregating people and creating environments where they can connect with each other in very rich and diverse ways. Much more of a mesh network than a hub and spoke network, and all the social network platforms that we know and love, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of those fit into that kind of platform. Now we're starting to move from transactions, buy, sell kinds of, or access and find and deliver kinds of transactions, to relationships that are starting to persist over time and evolve over time. Typically, they're relationships that or emerge around common interests. You know, it's common geography, common interest in terms of a topic, common professional backgrounds. So very rich kind of environment for relationships to form. I'll get to a third level of platform, which I would describe as a mobilization platform. Now we're doing something different. We're bringing participants together, not just to have relationships with each other, but to accomplish some shared goal, something out there that requires lots of participants to engage in. You can think about open source platforms in software as an interesting manifestation of that kind of mobilization platform. There's something that we call process networks, which have to do with aggregating participants around extended business processes and mobilizing them through an entire business process that spans many different participants to accomplish some business goal. You can think about social movements that require mobilization platforms of one type or another. So here we're starting to talk about deepening those relationships around a common goal, a common set of actions, not just interests, but we're moving together to accomplish something, and they often are great environments to spur distributed innovation. So lots of people trying different approaches to get to that end goal, but all mobilized around that common goal. And then there's finally a fourth platform that I would describe as a learning platform. Here the goal is to accelerate learning and performance improvement by all the participants in that area. And there are many different forms of learning. One of them has to do with feedback loops around data and information, and that's very helpful. But the kind of learning that we think is most powerful over time is creating new tacit knowledge. And that's a very different kind of learning. And what it requires at one level is people coming together in small units, teams, work groups, communities of practice, and engaging with each other and learning from each other in a very tacit knowledge dimension. But then connected, because those small units don't scale, is how do you connect all those small units into a larger network or infrastructure or environment or platform where you can draw out information and help from others. There aren't a lot of great examples of these learning platforms in business today, at least that we've been able to find, so we'd love to get suggestions or ideas from you. But one of the richest forms of these platforms that we've been able to find is actually an arena known as World of Warcraft. Where you have at one level small teams, small units, aggregated together into guilds, and incredible interaction among those participants where they've developed tacit knowledge at a very rapid rate, but where those teams are connected out and can access resources on a broader platform, everything from videos of specific forms of raids and watch and diagnose what worked and what didn't work in those raids, Q&A kinds of discussion forums where you can post a problem, see if anybody has an answer. But the real learning occurs within those smaller units in World of Warcraft. So, 4 levels, 4 different kinds of platforms. One of the interesting things to us is that if you think about platforms in general, one of the reasons we think there's so much interest in this topic is something known as network effects. One of the powerful things about platforms is that the more participants you get involved, typically the more value that gets created in aggregate. And it's typically an exponentially improving value, not just linear. That's really powerful, and it applies to all four of those levels of platforms that I talked about. The really interesting thing to us is that fourth platform, the learning platform, where we think there's a second order of increasing returns that comes into play. And the analogy I like to use is many people, it's kind of an outdated metaphor or image, but many people, when they talked about increasing returns, would talk about fax machines. In the old model, you know, if you had one fax machine, it had not just zero value, but actually negative value, because you had to buy it and you couldn't do anything with it. But the more fax machines that were out there that connected together, the more valuable each fax machine became. And really true. Very powerful network effects. But imagine this. In that model, the fax machine stays exactly the same. The functionality of that individual fax machine has not changed at all. It's just connecting to more fax machines. What if at the same time, each fax machine was improving exponentially in terms of performance based on learning from the other participants in the network? That's a second order of network effects that we think comes to play in these learning platforms. So that's why we're particularly interested in the power and potential of learning platforms as an opportunity to create economic value. So one thing just to highlight too is that I've talked about these as if they're four distinct siloed categories and you choose one versus another. In actual fact, these are not mutually exclusive by any means. And in fact, within some of these higher order platforms, particularly learning platforms, you can find all elements of the earlier forms of platforms. One example that we've become particularly fond of citing is a company called Lianfeng in China. They operate a global network of participants in supply networks for apparel designers. They have 15,000 partners in their network, participants in their network, on a global scale. And they've aggregated these participants. They have data on each one, what their capabilities are, what their performance has been. So there's a very strong aggregation component to it. They have relationships that have developed across these participants over time. They mobilize specific participants for particular design tasks for specific apparel designers. So they're coming together to actually deliver something to an end customer. But they're also very thoughtful about constructing a platform where learning occurs. One of the interesting things to us when we went out and interviewed the participants in this platform was we asked them, why are you part of the Lianfeng network? Without exception, top of mind, without prompting, the answer from all the participants was because we learn faster as part of the Lianfeng network than we ever could on our own or as part of anyone else's network. So I asked you to think about all the platforms you're involved with and how many of the participants in those platforms would give that answer. It's a very powerful answer, and it certainly builds incredible loyalty and a long-term willingness to collaborate over time because you're expanding the total value of the network through this learning process. Another interesting thing is that these platforms can be staged over time. I think from my experience working with companies around platform strategies and platform development, one of the biggest mistakes of all is over-engineering the platform at the outset. We're going to design the gold-plated platform. It's going to be able to do anything anybody could ever want to do, but it's going to take some time, and once we get it out there, though, wow, it's going to be amazing. And more often than not, it's not amazing It actually totally underestimated or misguessed as to what the participants really needed to do or could do on the platform. So the notion of being able to stage entry and build functionality over time is, I think, an important concept. And one of the examples that we use in this context is what SAP, the software company, did in early days of creating a developer network, a developer platform. They created an online platform. This was driven initially by Shai Agassi, who has gone on to other things. But in the early days, he was very thoughtful. He said, look, I want to do the simplest possible thing at the outset to be helpful to developers, both in third-party channels and in the customers of SAP. And so he created a very simple kind of discussion forum where a developer could come in and post a problem. You know, I'm writing code for this kind of application. I can't figure out how to develop this code. Anybody have any suggestions? And leave it to people to come in and propose suggestions. Long story short, over a relatively short period of time, this created dramatic engagement from participants. There are now over 2 million participants in this network. The average time, once a problem is posed by one of these application developers, and the time that a solution is offered that the problem presenter certifies was a solution to their problem, is 17 minutes. And it's compressing over time. So very powerful productivity driver for these application developers. But Shai did something also interesting, was he basically said, I'm going to create a reputation profile for people who provide solutions. And I'm going to give them points and recognition for having provided solutions, but I'm also going to specify the area of expertise that was demonstrated through the solutions they provided. So what kinds of applications, what kinds of coding problems were they addressing? And so these reputation profiles started to accumulate over time. Really interesting. This wasn't what the person said they could do or thought they could do. It was what they actually had done. A much more interesting kind of profile than your typical profile within a large enterprise. And one of the interesting things the reputation profile did was it became a magnet to attract other people within the network. They would see there's this person out there who has an expertise that I'm really interested in. Let me engage in a conversation and share some ideas and thoughts, not problems. We're moving beyond transaction to relationship here. Let's start a conversation. Let's engage around this common area of interest. And then, over time, this platform evolved further, and now they created shared workspaces where people could come together, these application developers could come together because they started to get interested in developing entirely new applications together. And so you had the workspaces where you could do this online, and these teams of application developers are coming together from all over the world. Some of them have never met each other in physical space, but formed deep relationships on this platform. So I think very interesting way of, again, thinking about staging these platforms that in some respects, from an economic viewpoint, significantly reduce the initial investment required, accelerate the positive returns from it, and probably most importantly, create interesting learning loops where you can start to see how people are actually using these platforms and evolve the functionality over time to address those emerging needs. So I've been giving you a very quick run through these different kinds of platforms. I want to just end on a couple of notes. One is I framed this as an opportunity. But I want to go back to this broader perspective around the big shift and the mounting performance pressure. And I want to make the case this is not an opportunity. It's an imperative. That the companies who do not figure out how to harness the power of platforms are going to be increasingly marginalized and ultimately pushed off the playing field. So this isn't just something to think about and consider as a possibility for additional value. You got to figure out how you're going to use this to stay alive. Very different kind of model. And the key here is, as was mentioned, I started my career at Boston Consulting Group a long time ago. I won't tell you how many years. But at the time, one of the things that BCG made its reputation on was one simple slide. It was called the experience curve. And it was basically driven initially by looking at the semiconductor industry and operating performance in the semiconductor industry over time. And they came up with this experience curve pattern of performance improvement. And over time, they applied it to a whole variety of other industries, everything from Japanese beer to toilet paper. And it turns out this experience curve is a very accurate descriptor of how performance improves in markets and industries. Huge accuracy, but one problem with it. It's a diminishing returns curve. The more experience you get in a market or industry, the longer and harder you have to work to get that next increment of performance improvement. And again, that's part of this mounting performance pressure that companies are experiencing. I would argue that the opportunity around these platforms, and particularly if you focus on the opportunity for learning platforms, that for the first time we have the opportunity to move from a diminishing returns curve to an increasing returns curve, where performance accelerates the more participants you engage on the platform. That's a very different kind of business model and very powerful as a way to address this mounting performance pressure. So I don't have a timekeeper, but I think I'm pretty close to the end of my time. So I don't know if we have time for a question or two at least. Yes.
So one of the things, outside of having gone to school here with Marshall and Jeff, one of the things that became kind of evident when I joined a big company is that MBA programs train product managers and very linear delivery mechanisms. In the worst case, explain that with the 5 forces of Porter and sort of a standard product management, and you go to market. And then you go to work and you hear clearly your message. And I think there is a difficult transition in thinking about how do you manage a platform versus a product, how do you sell the incentives properly, and I think we need more prescription rather than what you can get from that transition. What do you think?
Tell me about it. I've been fighting that battle for 30 years. The one lesson I have, and it deals with the issue of transformation, how do you move from a very old model, traditional model, to a very different model, new model. Over this 30 years, I've come to have deep respect for the immune system of large organizations. They are extremely powerful. And the other lesson I have from that experience is that if you think that transformation is a rational process where you just get the right data and do the right analytics, put it in the right PowerPoint charts and present it to the right people, and you get everybody on board, if you think it's a rational process, you've already lost. It is ultimately, from my experience at least, and again, I'm open to challenge on this, from my experience, it's an intensely political process. And it has 3 goals. One goal is to identify and strengthen the champions of change wherever possible. The second goal is to identify and neutralize the enemies of change. And by the way, that's not always easy, because the enemies of change usually don't self-identify. They're the ones who sit around a conference table when you presented all the data and analytics and nod and smile and say, yes, yes, absolutely, we've got to change. And then they go into their office and plot how they're going to undermine this process. So identifying and neutralizing the enemies of change. And then I'm a huge fan of the art of war. And one of the key lessons from the art of war is if you have to engage the enemy in battle, you've already lost the war. And so the question is, how do you postpone that confrontation between the enemies and the champions for as long as possible until you've neutralized as many of the enemies as possible and strengthened the champions as much as possible. And it's led us to a broader perspective around ways to drive change that we call scaling edges, that we think does have potential to avoid the immune system and achieve the change that's required.
Just heard Howard Schultz this morning talking about his funding of employees.
Yes.
And they asked him, why are you doing that? And what he was talking about was very much what you're saying in terms of accelerating learning. And he had a great quote. He said, if we're going to exceed the expectations of our customer, we have to exceed the expectations of our employees.
Yeah, no, it's great. And again, my tendency is to want to challenge to get to the next level, and I think the Starbucks Arizona State collaboration is a huge step forward. The interesting thing, at least so far, the way it's been described to me, is it's still individuals learning. And I think the most powerful learning occurs when you get teams or groups of people connected and focused on a performance issue that's truly challenging, and that's, I think, another level that hopefully, I'm sure Starbucks will eventually get to that one, for sure. I guess, I don't know if we still have time, one back, way in the back there.
Great talk, Ron. I like your point at the end about moving from a diminishing returns world to increasing returns with platforms. One of the things that might do is just give the first movers an advantage, or people who already have a lead. What do you do if you're not a first mover? What do you do if somebody else is already out ahead and they're building on those increasing returns? Are there any tips or strategies that you would suggest?
The good news, I think, first point is that I think that it's not just the platform owner that can win. It's anybody who participates in these platforms, assuming they know how to play the platform game. So even if the platform itself has been launched and there's a critical mass, the question in part becomes, how do I participate on that platform and participate in that increasing returns opportunity? There are also, I think the good news, it's always a good news, bad news story, but as was mentioned by Brian earlier, I'm a very strong believer in the notion of accelerating disruption, that part of this mounting pressure is the disruptive forces. So no matter what platform is out there, and even if it's achieved some critical mass in terms of participants, there's always an opportunity to rethink what is the game that I can play. And in particular, I think these four categories of platforms can be helpful because from my experience, most of the platforms out there are still at the very simple aggregation or maybe social platform level. There are relatively few that have moved into mobilization or learning platforms. And one of the disruptive opportunities is to come into an arena where an aggregation platform holds court and say, no, we're creating a platform that will take it even further around mobilization or learning. And I think over time that will draw more and more participants into that platform.
One more.
I had actually plenty of the challenges I feel like that I'm hearing from individuals around me, and of course through your whole talk, we were kind of nodding. And I probably did. It was just like, oh my God, yeah. And that's because I've spent probably most of my career working on platforms, and I can't say it was by accident that happened. Everything from payment platforms to digital publishing, e-learning, and presently marketplace platform. I think the biggest challenge with it is those three things you mentioned, is that kind of big bang mentality that folks have, where they think that you've got to get everything done all at once, as opposed to actually learning from the market and evolving the platform over time. That's a very hard thing to explain. The change is another really, really big one. especially when you're moving a company from, say, a retail business model into one where they're essentially allowing their competitors in a marketplace to make money from them.
Yes.
All of the retail folks want to kill you. And so I guess the challenge that I have, and I think that others have, is really sometimes not even about explaining the benefits from a business perspective in terms of the opportunities, the market opportunities. It's actually twofold. I think it's first of all around how do you really explain the complexities around playing that platform game, around, for example, why you would take a platform through these almost like levels of evolution, starting with aggregation. At least I spend most of my time doing that, and I could totally relate to the comment about product and what product typically means, because I'm head of product in the company that I work for, and really basically our product is the platform. So instead of saying products versus platforms, we have people who manage products like the retail products we sell, but I manage the platform as a product. And I find, again, that the hardest thing is just trying to understand how do you explain these concepts and how do you explain a strategy and an incremental strategy to folks who are still wrapping their minds around what the concept of a platform really is.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and I'm afraid I don't have any magic, any silver bullet that's going to answer it. I do think that part of it is being able to walk people through examples of platforms that are out there and how they have disrupted traditional markets. I think part of it has to do with understanding at a deep level the economics in the business and being able to frame an economic case where, again, I think the core challenge for platform advocates or champions, if you will, within an organization is how do we think about platform staging so we can reduce the investment, shorten the lead time to returns, and maximize the early returns so we can start to build a business case for senior management that will say, okay, this is something that could be really interesting. Maybe we should put more money into it.
Thank you.
Thank you.